Good afternoon, esteemed panelists and ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's Midpoint online discussion. At events of the Midpoint, we aim to get ahead of the everyday curve of current affairs to discuss the big issues in South Africa and in international relations and politics. We do this from a centrist political perspective in which we look for pragmatic policies and politics that lie between socialism and small state capitalism. Sponsored by the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, we aim to promote multi-party democracy, the rule of law, and the social market economy. We invite you to sign up for our newsletter at themidpoint.org.za to hear about future events of this nature. Today's event is a book launch, which we're very happy to host. CREDO, the Center for Research on Democracy at Stellenbosch University, has released a research work titled Democracy Under Pressure, Resilience or Retreat. It attempts to answer the question of why democracy prospers in some places and withers in others, by comparing countries and thus isolating the crucial drivers. We are joined by some of the authors of the book today. I'd like to welcome Professor Ursula von Birk, Professor Dirk Berg-Schlosser, Dr. Catherine Musuva, and Dr. Cindy Steenekamp. The topic of the health of democracy is of international concern. Recent events such as the storming of the US Capitol and its mirror protests in Brazil, if you consider things like the hollowing of substantive democracy in Turkey and in Hungary, and a general regression in international democracy shown in the VDEM dataset, should really make everybody who cares about liberalism, democracy, human dignity, and thus the poor and the marginalized, sit up. As a member of CAS, I'm proud to participate in this knowledge-sharing forum with experts in the fields of democracy. By creating spaces like this, insights are developed and shared with the wider public. In this spirit, I encourage you to make use of the chat function on the side. We have scheduled time at the end of the conversation for a Q&A with the audience. I'd like to note as well that the opinions expressed on this webinar are, of course, not necessarily those of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. I look forward to today's discussion and to seeing you at the next Midpoint event. Please come to our website to see when that will be. I hand the floor to you, Ursula.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for the many years of very fruitful cooperation. The CAS has already launched our previous book, so this is a privilege to be chosen again for that kind of support. And also thank you for CAS for sponsoring a master's scholarship for CREDO. This is highly appreciated. CREDO is a new institution which has only been created last year, but we have the good fortune of building on over a quarter century of research on democracy. And the book that we are now presenting to you today is the fifth one in a series. We started with Poland and South Africa in transition, which were two countries 30 years ago or thereabouts, which had tremendous potential or showed tremendous potential to be the leaders of democratization in their respective regions. Since that first comparison, we have actually entered on a path of pioneering path because we have added leading democracies. We have selected the most promising democracies from other regions of all major cultural regions of the world to compare, to see how culture influences the democratization transition and the whole process of it. So we started many years ago when the general euphoria overtook the world. Democracy was successful. Democracy won the Cold War, so to speak. We thought we have reached the end of ideological wars and we will live happily ever after. Unfortunately, as we know from data and our own analysis, this is actually not the case. So we continue our research now with a view to find out what exactly has gone wrong and whether there's anything that we could do to make things get better again. Our team consists of about over 20 leading scholars from 12 countries in Africa, in the Middle East, in East Asia, Europe, as well as North and South America. And all the authors of this particular book are research fellows of CREDO. So we are all in one big team. We work together. We work to the similar schedule as well as a joint conceptual framework, which gives our book a sense of being written by a single author, which is very important. The leading question, as Chris has already pointed out, is why some democracies in this one, why is a country in a specific region subject to the same cultural influences, subject to the same global impacts, retaining its democracy on a higher level, and while another country in that same region is backsliding. So that was the leading question for all the authors. The book consists of two parts. The first one is theoretical and reflective. It gives background to the whole discussion, and it is then followed by by analytical chapters which are based on empirical data and which my colleague Dirk Bergschlosser will be presenting. I would like to tell you something about the first part. It consists of 3 chapters, and the first one has been written by our colleague Professor Christer Jonsson, who is asking the question, what did we not foresee 30 years ago when democracy was such a great winner? And he starts with his discussion by describing the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then he identifies 6, there are many more, I'm sure, causes of the regression trend, but he is talking about the digital revolution, economic inequalities that are rising, decline in multilateralism, rise of nationalism, climate change, and the COVID pandemic and its after effects. The 2 general conclusions that Christer drew was that we have, as humans, a very limited ability to foresee the future, even in such a relatively short period of time. But more importantly, he points out to the necessity for re-establishing bridges for dialogue between national institutions and those that are international, because our problems need to be jointly sorted out. The following chapter is by our economist from our own university, Dr. Kriha Siebrits, and his is a very interesting chapter that looks historically at the previous 3 industrial revolutions and what the technological changes these revolutions have brought in terms of impacting human development. So he's talking about the first industrial revolution of the 18th century, the importance of the invention of the steam engine. Then he goes to the second industrial revolution of the late 19th century with its electrification, assembly line, mass produced goods, and what that has had to do with labor and how the relationships have developed in that respect. And then he talks briefly about the third revolution, which was the computer revolution started in 1960s. Going on to the current, what we call fourth industrial revolution, with its global digitalization, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, and all the things that have overtaken the globe by storm. His interest in pursuing this particular topic is to reflect on the question of how effective, what kind of policy responses should there be to the disruptive effect, in many ways disruptive effects of technological change, and what kind of responses would assure that democracy is safeguarded and that it can actually be leading adaptation to these changes. The final chapter in that opening section I have written. It's by Ursula von Bieck, that would be me. And I have attacked the issue of a very popular and widely discussed issue of populism. I won't bore you with the details. I just would like to stress two things. First of all, that populism there is a conflicting logic between liberal democracy and populism. Liberal democracy stresses the importance of protection of individual freedom and the rule of law, whereas populism does not recognize individuals as such. Populism considers individuals to be a group of a homogeneous collective and who they claim to represent. Now that is a very serious problem because it causes polarization, and polarization in turn stops any ability to communicate between those polarized entities. So populism is a serious problem, and I'm illustrating the extent of that problem on two countries of our core interests, which is Turkey and Poland. In both cases, populism has taken root. Populist leaders have come to power. And strangely enough, even though these countries are so different from each other, the major cause, major factor that has aided populism in its march forward has been religion. Christianity in Poland, which has always been a marker of identity, very strong marker of identity, and of course Islam in Turkey, which plays the same role. And finally, so that section is followed then by the empirical part of the 16 cases that have been thoroughly examined by our colleagues, and Professor Bergschlosser is the co-author of two chapters that have taken the 16 together analytically. They have introduced the cases first, and then they have analyzed the results. And his co-author is a team member of ours, Professor Ursula Hoffmann-Lange from Marburg University in Germany. And the book ends with a conclusion. Sorry?
Bamberg University.
Bamberg, yes. Sorry, you are Marburg, yes. The book ends with a conclusion that looks forward. A conclusion written by one of our professors emeritus from Stellenbosch University, our own department, Professor Pierre de Toy, who refers to the opening chapter of the book to bring this like a rondo in music, to show that these various factors that have weakened democracy, they are dangerous in themselves, but there are various connections between them that jointly make them even more dangerous to democracy. And the book ends with his exhortation that we need an urgent mechanism for collective decision-making at the highest level, and to reconfigure essentially the relationship between humans and their natural environment in the first place. And more importantly, more to the point here, that we need to reimagine democracy as a system of rule that would be able to tackle this very huge task that we have in front of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ursula, for that introduction to the book and to the introduction to CREDO. As a next step, I'd like to hand over to Dirk. If you could tell us a little bit about the empirical section of the book, that would be very welcome. I give the floor to you for about 10-15 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I come now to the broader empirical assessments in our book, covering the last 3 decades and going specifically into a number of paired and triple comparisons, which we did in different regions of the world. I think it's worth noting that today is the first anniversary of Putin's brutal war in Ukraine, with economic and political consequences worldwide, for example, in terms of energy and food supplies, also the COVID-19 pandemic is not yet over. We feel the effects of long-term climate change, droughts and inundations, and even the terrible earthquake in Turkey and Syria has some man-made effects in terms of lack of control of building standards and corruption of officials. So there are many reasons for concern. Indeed, we are faced with accumulation of crises. Our central question here and in the book is there also a general crisis of democracy? As Ursula mentioned, there certainly are cases of democratic backsliding, populism, social polarization, and for example, the latest report by the Varieties of Democracy Institute in Gothenburg in Sweden, the 2022 report, states, and I quote in the introduction, the level of democracy worldwide is down to 1989 levels. The last 30 years of democratic advances are now eradicated. End of quote. And this is based on their population-weighted indices of liberal and electoral democracy. In my view, this statement is too sweeping and overly alarmist. For example, the case of India alone, with a population of 1.4 billion people, accounts for a large part of this change on a population basis. For example, the Liberal Democracy Index for 2014 for India is 0.54. For 2021, it is 0.36. But nevertheless, in spite of this decline, India today, in spite of Prime Minister Modi's and his party, the BJP's Hinduistic nationalism, India still has a well-working federal system, an independent judiciary and media, a strong opposition and civil society, and it can be called at least what has become known as an electoral democracy, a democracy with some defects and some shortcomings, but nevertheless on the democratic side. Therefore, I argue that more differentiation and a deeper analysis is needed, as witnessed in our new book, which is being launched today. I first present some macro-level, political system-level data, for example, the overall regional values on table 1. Table 1, Chris?
Coming up. There we go.
Here you can see first the data for 1990, as a result of what Huntington called the third wave of worldwide democratization, then values for the year 2007, just the year before what was called the Great Depression, the worldwide financial and economic crisis, and now the latest data for 2019. As you can see, between 1990 and 2007, these democracy scores increased for all regions and worldwide from 0.31 to 0.41. If you look at the latest figures, the decline is mostly in Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and also North America, but on a worldwide basis, it is relatively marginal, 0.41 to 0.40. So in this respect, we have to look at, in a deeper way, at what is happening in the various areas. And so, and nowhere, if you can see this on this table, we are back to the 1990 levels. So that's what I consider to be overstated in the Reading report. So we have to look at details of democratic resilience or backsliding of democracy. And we did this, as Ursula already mentioned, by selecting cases which were more resilient in a specific region and contrasted this to one or two cases which were more backsliding or not so resilient. And this, in technical terms, is called a most similar systems, different outcome research design, in short, MSDO, which takes into account the broader geopolitical, historical, cultural, other factors which are similar, but we can then look in detail what causes or what are the most important factors leading to a different outcome in these specific regions. And so, for example, we contrasted Uruguay on the one hand to Argentina and Chile on the other in Latin America, Estonia versus Poland in Eastern Europe, Canada versus the US in North America, etc. And we, in this way, had selected 16 cases altogether. And we tested the major hypotheses of empirical democratic theory with a special, more recent analytic technique called qualitative comparative analysis, QCA for short. And we tested, for example, levels of economic development, more recent socioeconomic changes, increasing social inequality, populism, strong social polarization, gender inequality, good or often bad governance, and similar factors. And we could use worldwide data which are available by different sources, the United Nations Development Program, the World Bank, BDEM again. And so we could combine in such an analysis the strongest negative factors which led to a decline of democracy in a particular number of cases. And this is shown in table 2. And here we had all the countries on the left-hand side in this special technique. I'm not going into the technical details. And we had the major factors as an increase of corruption change between 2007 and 2018, an increase in social inequality, sometimes a strengthening or a decrease of civil society, stronger clientelism, and altogether some effects on the level of democracy. And this we can show that by using this analysis, different configurations and patterns emerge across worldwide regions. So, for example, Turkey and South Africa, as cases of strong backsliding over the last decades, have some elements in common. Or as an example of stronger resilience, Estonia in Eastern Europe and Germany share a number of factors which led to that stronger resilience. I cannot give you all the detailed data here. You have to at least read our book, if not buy it, but it's also an ebook edition, of course, and if your university buys it, you have access free of charge. So this is a very broad assessment of some of the factors on the macro level, but in addition, our good colleague Ursula Hoffmann-Lange contributed a micro level analysis, which means on the general population level, using the latest available so-called World Values Surveys data, the 7th wave of these worldwide surveys which have taken place over the last almost 40 years. So we could see how people in the general population view democracy, how they assess their own democracies, but also how they value a democratic political system in general. And so we have this on table 3. In the graph, you can see The blue line shows, well, let's start. The orange line starts with a general evaluation of democracy, or the green line, the importance of to live in a democracy. So you can see across all regions, these are very, very high values, going up to 80–90% of the total population who have such a high esteem for democracy. But to have a more meaningful measure, we added another element. How much would you support a strong leader from the military or some other authoritarian leader? And there you see the brown line. And this is fairly strong in a number of regions. So what we actually did to assess the overall support for democracy, we had to deduct support for a strong leader from this more general positive evaluation of democracy. And there you can see that the blue line is still most strongly in what I call the Western democracies, and in some areas it is much less, but still worldwide, given all the 87 countries which participated in several of these survey waves, you can see there is still also strong popular support. Then we looked at, well, one more important element, which goes back to a specific perception of, well, long-term value changes, which may be conducive to further democratization. And this is a concept developed by two well-known colleagues, Ronald Inglehart from the United States and Christian Welzel from Germany. And they found or claim that this long-term value change, particularly in terms of greater gender equality, also greater freedom of choice, for example, acceptance of abortion, tolerance of sexual diversity, and similar factors, is a long-term element conducive to further democratization. And this is shown in table 4.
Dirk, can I give you another 2 minutes?
Yes, I hurry up. So you can see for the Western democracies, this has been very strong. The gray line is the worldwide line is also going up. For Africa, the line is going down, but this may be as one possibility due to the fact that from wave to wave of the survey, not always the same countries were included. So this could be an element in this. Now we come to, well, if we compare the effect of different types of political systems, for example, closed autocracies on the one hand, like in China, Saudi Arabia, or Iran, electoral autocracies, which are hybrid systems with some facade democratic elements, as in Putin's Russia, electoral democracies, which are democracies with some restrictions, as in South Africa, and full-fledged liberal democracies, as in Sweden, which was our benchmark case in the analysis. We can check the overall socioeconomic and governance performance, and this is listed in tables 6 and 7. We can do this quite briefly. We see, well, for all elements, liberal democracies fare best if you take per capita income. The mean here, $37,000 per capita. The closed autocracies come second, but these include a number of the oil-rich countries in the Middle East. The electoral autocracies fare worst, and the electoral democracies are also better off than the electoral autocracies. And this also applies to other indicators like life expectancy, schooling, health systems, and similar elements. And so in this respect, and we come to table 7, which shows the governance scores of these different political system types. Also, corruption is least in the liberal democracies, it is worst in the electoral autocracies, and the other systems are somewhere in between. And this also applies to governance effectiveness, political stability, and similar such indicators. Altogether, I would argue there is no reason for democratic defeatism. Some cautious optimism may nevertheless be justified, which is also demonstrated by the fact that some of the well-known populists like Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom, Bolsonaro in Brazil, President Trump in the United States, all were not re-elected. And this also shows that they actually governed badly, and people were realizing that they were taken in by such populist slogans. So altogether, in future, I think we have to pay more attention in our studies to democratic resilience, which is an important effect which has been neglected in some of the studies in the more recent years. We also have to look at transitions from authoritarianism, like it happened in the late 80s and early 90s. And there, for example, strong social movements play a role, strong protest demonstrations like now in Iran, Belarus, other parts of the world. And it's important to look at the details in each case and to see whether there may be what is called a rupture with the previous regime or some pacted transitions. And in these constellations, the internal divisions between hardliners and softliners in different camps are very important. And this may even be the case in Russia today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dirk. Much appreciate the acceleration at the end. Cindy, can I just ask, how is the ESCOM situation, speaking about good governance?
I have 36 minutes left.
Okay, good. So I guess the power did not come back on at Cindy's house. So we'll let Cindy go next while she is available. I'm going to switch on your slide presentation immediately. Please. And we can carry on. There we go. There's your slide presentation and start. Good. Thank you very much. Cindy, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chris. And again, let me echo Ursula and Dirk in thanking CAS for allowing us this opportunity to present our research. So the title of the chapter, co-authored by Catherine Masuva and myself, is Political Culture in Africa, a comparative analysis of democratic values in South Africa and Kenya. The primary aim of our chapter was really to investigate the status and the strength of democracy in sub-Saharan Africa. Our more specific focus was to try and understand some of the characteristics of democratic communities by measuring both political culture as well as democratic values in two political regimes, namely South Africa and Kenya, that are both at varying stages of their democratization. Please change the slide. So we know that democracy is indeed in recession worldwide. In 2022, less than half of the world's population lived in a democracy of some sort, whether that be a full democracy or a flawed democracy. And according to the Economist's Democracy Index, only 8% of people resided in a full democracy, while more than a third of the world's population lived under authoritarian rule just last year. Similarly, we know that democracy has been in retreat in Africa for some time, at least the last 7 years, which is well before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And authoritarian forms of government continue to dominate on the continent. Of course, we do need to keep in mind that sub-Saharan African countries do not have this long tradition of democratic rule, which is very much the case in the West. South Africa only transitioned to democracy from apartheid rule in 1994, which was a couple years after multi-party elections were reinstated in Kenya. And it wasn't until 2002 that Kenya actually formally democratized. Today, both countries have fairly sophisticated democratic political systems and state institutions that are not only in place, but they do function formally. But Catherine and I started to ask whether it was the ideals of liberal democracy. In what way have they taken root? Have they become entrenched? Have they been achieved in either of these countries? When we consider some of the macro level data from Varieties of Democracy and Freedom House, they all show that both countries had relatively similar liberal democracy scores at the time of their respective transitions. But the overall improvement in South Africa has been far better than Kenya, and the scores have not only been consistently higher, but by a considerable margin in South Africa. We know that these macro level investigations are incredibly rich and important when studying democracies. But it's important to note that we can measure so much about a democracy when we also tap into individual or micro level data. And that's because stable, effective democracies, of course, they require formal democratic institutions and state machinery on the one hand, but they also require a political culture that's conducive to democracy on the other. In our chapter, we adopted what's become known as the hierarchical model of system culture, which was actually developed by a CREDO colleague of ours, Professor Dieter Fuchs, in 2007. And what we did was we measured 3 objects of a political system: values, structure, and process, as well as their attitudinal constructs. For our descriptive empirical analysis, we used the last 3 rounds of the Afrobarometer survey conducted in South Africa and Kenya between 2011 and 2019. And in this presentation, I'll provide a very brief overview of our main empirical findings, while my co-author Catherine will discuss the possible explanation for those findings. Please change the slide. The first level of the model of system culture, or the cultural level, this taps into citizens' commitment to democratic values. So the assumption here is that societies that hold strong democratic values are those whose citizens not only have a high level of support for democracy as a preferred regime type, but they are also going to reject any forms of authoritarian rule. If you take a look at the graph, you'll see the top 2 lines show support for democracy in Kenya in maroon and South Africa in gold, while the bottom dotted lines show support for authoritarianism. It's clear that commitment to democratic values is stronger amongst Kenyans than South Africans at the micro or the individual level. We can see that Kenyans held high levels of support for democracy as their preferred regime type, with more than 75% of citizens in agreement at each time point under investigation. Kenyan citizens also very strongly disapproved or rejected authoritarianism. The outlook in South Africa, however, doesn't seem to be as promising. Of course, at a first glance, it's clear that the majority of South African citizens support democracy and they also reject authoritarianism. This is good for the cultural level. But when we take into account that longitudinal trend, we'll see that support for democracy declined by almost 20% in South Africa from 2011, while support for authoritarianism increased by almost 15%. And what this means in real terms is that by 2018, little more than half of South Africans preferred democracy to any other kind of government, while 38% approved of authoritarian alternatives. Please change the slide. The structural level, or the second level, refers to citizens' support for a democratic regime in a given country. And here, the assumption is that societies that support their democratic regime are those where citizens are not only going to have a high level of satisfaction in the current political dispensation, but they'll also have a high level of confidence in state institutions. We can see from these bar charts that in the case of Kenya, satisfaction with the current political regime was moderate but improved, whereas confidence in the state was stable and remained unchanged over time. In South Africa, the levels of satisfaction with as well as confidence in the regime declined over time and actually dropped below 50% in 2015 as well as 2018. So very similar to the cultural level, citizen support for the democratic regime starts to illustrate not only a divergence between the attitudes of Kenyans and South Africans, but is very clearly stronger once again amongst Kenyans at an individual level. Please change the slide. The procedural level, the third level of this model of system culture, relates specifically to support for political processes as well as political authorities. And the assumption is that societies that embrace political authority are those where citizens are fairly likely to experience low levels of coercion or violence when it comes to political goods and political goals. And these citizens will also practice high levels of law-abidingness. And we can see from the data that there's a fairly mixed bag of results. Of particular concern is that the majority of South African and Kenyan citizens indicated that they feared or have experienced political violence when it comes to political competition or attending political events. And this obviously weakens the consolidation of democratic values in both countries. On a slightly more positive note, the data also shows that levels of law-abidingness increased in Kenya between 2011 and 2018, while the levels of law-abidingness in South Africa were high and remained relatively high over time. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Chris, and I hand over to my co-author, Catherine, to make sense of all of these interesting results.
Thank you very much, Cindy. I will now take you through our analysis of the findings presented by my co-author in the next few slides. So starting at the cultural level, how did we interpret the stronger commitment to democratic values in Kenya and the declining support for democracy in South Africa? First, we analyzed the nature of support for democracy, whether it was intrinsic or instrumental for insights. The positive results in Kenya could arguably be reflective of the optimism that followed a very significant moment in Kenya's democratic trajectory. That is the promulgation of a new constitution in 2010. And this was after 20 years of trying to break from the old constitutional order. The level of support for democracy in Kenya could also be an indicator of democracy delivering socio-economic benefits to Kenyans and a reflection of the democratic dividend of the devolved system of government, which is a key feature of the 2010 Constitution. Now, that is not to say that devolution in Kenya has not had its own set of challenges, but rather it's just to say that the transformative power of devolution is visible and tangible throughout the country, and particularly in previously marginalized areas. So that could be a contributing factor for the levels of optimism. In South Africa, the not so promising outlook points to the fact that the initial euphoria that accompanied the transition to democracy has waned over the years. The loss of faith in democracy is largely as a result of the high levels of inequality, poverty and unemployment, and the inability of the state to meet expectations regarding job creation, healthcare, housing, and the inability to provide other tangible benefits to the majority of its population. Secondly, we look at trends in elections in both countries for additional insights. And we find that in Kenya, despite problematic electoral processes in 2013 and in 2017, including an annulled presidential election in 2017, electoral participation remains high, between 78% and 86% in the period under investigation. Also, despite tightly contested elections, we see less electoral violence and Kenyans being able to exist peacefully after elections despite their political differences. It's a different story in South Africa. South Africa has a history of credible elections, which is very positive, but we see that citizens are choosing to withdraw from elections. There's a steady decline in voter registration as a proportion of the voting age population by 5 percentage points, and a steady decline in voter turnout, which at the 2019 elections stood at 49%. So at the cultural level, we interpreted the findings on citizens' commitment by looking at the nature of support for democracy, whether intrinsic or instrumental support, and by looking at electoral trends in the two countries. In the next slide, please, I describe how we made sense of the findings at the structural level. To understand the satisfaction with the regime and confidence in institutions, Cindy and I examined the three elements of political governance listed here: political parties, corruption or bad governance, and COVID responses. In Kenya, there is a weak party system characterized by shambolic party primaries, new political formations and ruling parties every election, and poorly institutionalized parties centered around individuals who mobilize support along ethnic lines. Some effects of this are weak parliamentary performance and clientelistic practices in government. Therefore, it's not surprising that the assessment of the regime is moderate and unchanged over time. In contrast, South Africa has a dominant party system, having been ruled by the ANC since 1994, and this dominance is something that political parties in Kenya really admire about South Africa. So this dominance and the association of the ANC with the liberation struggle has made it difficult for the opposition to make inroads. Parliamentary oversight in South Africa is also weak, and opposition parties also have their own issues that makes them not trusted by citizens. Even parties such as the DA that has a good track record of governance and service delivery in certain areas. Corruption. Corruption is a major contributing factor to the level of confidence and trust in the regime. Kenya has a longer history of corruption scandals, and the embezzlement of public money is pervasive. In South Africa, much of the highly publicized corruption scandals are more recent and associated with the Zuma era. In our chapter, we talk about how corruption in Kenya and South Africa has reached the level of state capture, which explains why mega theft continues and why it is never successfully prosecuted and punished. Very importantly, we note that state capture poses an existential threat to both of these democracies. In terms of COVID response, I need to clarify that the Afrobarometer survey data we used goes up to 2019 and did not cover attitudes around COVID response by governments, so this was an add-on. And we found data from Ipsos and Kantar showing that in 2020, public trust and the government's handling of the pandemic waned over time. So at the structural level, public trust is stable but moderate in Kenya and declining in South Africa due to the party systems, state capture, and how governments handled the pandemic. Next slide, please. To explain the mixed bag of results that Cindy presented, we analyzed the nature of political engagement around elections or in between elections and the use of information and communication technologies by the two governments for possible explanations. On the negative side, in Kenya and South Africa, violence is part of the political culture, and this explains the low level of freedom from political violence. In Kenya, this is visible around campaign time, and in South Africa, violent protests are common in informal settlements and underdeveloped areas. There is also evidence of the instrumentalization of violence as a political strategy by the EFF party in South Africa. South Africans and Kenyans considered to be law-abiding to the digitalization of certain government services. Now, to be clear, law-abiding here very narrowly refers to not having had to pay a bribe for state services. In Kenya, citizens can apply for various documents such as IDs, passports, driver's licenses, and other documents online through the eCitizen website and also through one-stop physical centers known as Huduma centers. Similarly, South Africans can apply for documents such as these through their banks. These initiatives, which are designed to only take electronic payments, have drastically cut down face-to-face interaction between citizens and government officials, hence reducing opportunities for bribery. Next slide, please. Before I conclude our presentation, I would like to mention that we have a section in our chapter that reflects on the prospects for democratic consolidation in the two country cases based on specific threats identified in our findings. I'm afraid time does not allow us to discuss it, so I will conclude with a key takeaway of our chapter. In summary, our overall findings are twofold, and herein lies the main message of our chapter, that based on Afrobarometer data, or from a study of public attitudes towards democracy, Kenya fares better than South Africa. According to macro-level assessments, the reverse is true. As my co-author said, South Africa is a more advanced democracy according to the Varieties of Democracy Index, which classifies South Africa as an electoral democracy and Kenya as an electoral authoritarian regime. Our analysis highlights the incongruence that exists between macro-level and micro-level analysis of democracy. But this incongruence does not in any way point to unreliable macro or micro-level data or a problematic selection of cases for comparison. Instead, it reinforces the notion that there is not only one way to study democracy, and that citizens' evaluations of their own democracy yield interesting insights. Finally, the incongruence in real terms points to the resilience of Kenyan citizens who, despite considerably weaker democratic state machinery and serious socio-economic challenges, have continued to develop democratic norms and values that are necessary for the persistence of democracy. By contrast, the regression of democratic norms and values among South Africans shows that, despite strong structural and institutional frameworks, perceptions of poor governance and government performance could weaken the status and strength of democracy. Thank you very much to the participants, to CAS for having us, and also to Afrobarometer for granting us access to the data.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Cindy. Now I'm aware of the fact, Cindy, that ESCOM is in fact cutting you short soon. So perhaps I can send a question your way immediately because we now shift to the Q&A section. Having a look at your data, I was curious to understand, how do you assess when a change in data points becomes significant? I'm just going to shift back in the slides.
Yes.
And at face value, it seems like the differences are fairly small from the beginning to end. So if we look at Kenya, the support for democracy goes from 80 to 79%. Is that a significant number?
No, it's not. You know, there's no minimum threshold, and that's why I think longitudinally it's always interesting to look at. Rather, a movie is often more interesting than a single photograph, right? Because there's so much to consider. Of course, with us, we didn't want to take as historical approach necessarily because that had been covered in chapters previously by Dirk. We were looking at more contemporary political activities and more, contemporary political arenas to consider, well, what is the status quo? There's always there's a lot of historical explanations around a lot of the findings at macro and the micro level. But for us, we want to concentrate on really just the most recent time points. Because there has been such significant political events in both countries over such a short period of time. What we're seeing at the micro level in Kenya is that really over the past 10 or so years, that there hasn't been much change in terms of micro level data, that there seems to be support for democracy, regime, and so on, and it remains stable, which is incredibly important if Kenyan democracy is going to consolidate, because you have that grassroots support in place. It now then becomes, you need the more formal democratic infrastructure to step up to the challenge and support that will of Kenyans. The case of South Africa, though, is the opposite. We see that in a relatively short amount of time, just over 10 years, we're seeing how quickly support for democracy is backsliding. And this particular graph is interesting to me because what we start to see with the two gold lines, and which is very concerning, is do you see how those over 3 time points are actually moving closer together, where they should be moving further apart?
Thank you. That is helpful for me to understand the data points a little bit better. Dirk and Ursula, do you want to pose some questions to Cindy before she disappears into the darkness? So Ursula, I think you might be on mute. Ursula, we couldn't hear you, and Dirk as well. I think you're both on mute.
They have both read considerable inputs prior to publication.
Thank you, Cindy. That's exactly it. So, no, I just wanted to say that I have clarified quite a few issues while I was editing the book, so I have no additional questions for Cindy or Catherine at this point. Maybe Dirk does.
Sorry, Dirk, you're also you're unmuted. press the button at the top on your microphone.
Now you hear me?
Yes. We've got you now.
Okay, good. I would like to point to some fact which Catherine mentioned, namely that at the macro level, Kenya was rated much worse than South Africa. And to some extent, this may be due to the kinds of indices which are used. And VDEM, which is a major source and altogether by far the most valid index in many ways, is based on expert judgments. And these experts are both based in the respective countries, and they are, well, international experts, people at Gothenburg. And so there is an element of perception in this expert judgment. And I happen to be relatively well familiar with Kenya. I conducted research there myself over the last 50 years, and I also am a little bit less familiar, but I've been there so many times also with South Africa. So my own assessment, if you may call me an expert, would differ as far as Kenya is concerned. So at least for the last 12 or so years, Kenya has become more consolidated as a democracy. Catherine mentioned the new constitution, the devolution, regular turnovers at the elections, which doesn't mean that everything is perfect in Kenya, but in the international perception, Kenya perhaps fares a bit worse than it deserves. And so this may be one of the factors lying behind this apparent discrepancy between the macro level and the micro level by popular perceptions.
Cindy, when you comment on the increase in political violence or the decrease in the freedom from political violence in South Africa, what do you attribute that to since 2011?
Well, of course, it will be, it's often, well, especially as we've seen over the last few years, it's regional based as well. And in these cases, it's not necessarily that the respondents have experienced political violence, but it's whether they have feared, they have not attended political events, political rallies, or certain political events because of fear of being threatened or intimidated. And so the measure it's imperfect, but again, it's perception based on the part of participants, whether they fear intimidation or threat or whether they have. And what we did was we actually just combined these measures of those who are both afraid of, but have also experienced political violence when it comes to political events. What we will see is that those who fear political violence, of course, there is more of those than those who are reporting to have experienced it. And as I've mentioned as well, it definitely depends on region. Of course, when we look at this data within more metropolitan areas, and then of course in more hotly contested provinces, provincially, if you look at KwaZulu-Natal, for example, it's far higher. They have a very different political culture, and we can even argue that various forms of political violence have been usurped into the political culture of those regions as well as they compete during elections and between elections for political power as well.
So that sub-country variation that you described, does that also exist in Kenya? Maybe Catherine, can you jump in? Are there sections of Kenya that are more affected by political violence?
Well, I did say that over time we are seeing less violence in Kenya's elections, which is a very good thing. And I also did say that it's predominantly around election time that we will see politicians using the violence.
Oh, I think Catherine's gone. Perhaps Mauritius is also under ESCOM. There we go. Sorry, Catherine, you just phased out for a second. You mentioned that there's been less violence in Kenya.
Oh. Yeah, well, it might be my hotel Wi-Fi. And Chris, you forgot to mention to the participants that I'm taking this call from my hotel room in Mauritius. Hence the back.
Happy that the cyclone didn't hit it.
Thankfully not. So I wouldn't say it's regional based in the way that it is in South Africa, but I would say it's more around the elections that we would see that, and that it's more of a campaign strategy rather than maybe the post-election violence that historically took place, I would say up until 2017.
If you turn, can I maybe turn to you for a moment? You mentioned the potential weakness in the VDEM dataset, and there's always weaknesses to dataset, that they look at a population-weighted comparison. Would you take us through alternatives to that weighting mechanism and what kind of results you would achieve by changing that weighting mechanism? Would you always agree with the conclusion, though, that democracy is receding globally?
Well, in the first table I showed you, this was not confirmed if you use population-weighted data. If you do it by region, you see more precisely where democracy increased and where it declined. If you take Asia and the Pacific, it increased from 2007 to 2019. It decreased, but relatively slightly if you take all countries of the region. In Eastern Europe, a bit more strongly in Latin America. MENA region remained stable at a low level, to be sure. Sub-Saharan Africa remained also practically stable, and this also applies to the world figures altogether. So, well, there was decline in Western Europe and North America, and this is part of the fact that worldwide attention is, and international media are focused more on the Western world in many ways, and too much so, and much of what is happening in other parts of the world is neglected by international media. And so the appearance of a general decline and backsliding, or even, as it was the title of a book, the possible death of democracy, for example, in the United States, has created a lot of attention, but there also, in my view, was an element of alarmism inside. We have to be worried, to be sure, if there are declines of democracy, if the judiciary is no longer independent, if the media are curtailed or censored, if the civil society is very much restricted, as happens in many countries. I'm not going to deny all this, but if we take a global look or a regional look, we have to differentiate. And there are positive cases and negative cases, and our analysis can contribute to how to identify which factors lead to the more positive outcomes and which factors lead to the more negative outcomes. And this precisely was our research design. And the example just presented by Cindy and Catherine shows this very well, you know, how in some respects the countries share a number of background features, but nevertheless they went on to different trajectories, which has historical reasons, ethnic reasons, cultural reasons, others which play a role.
Thank you, Dirk. Ursula, if I turn to you now, What would be your main takeaways from the book that you would take to policymakers or to the media to alert them to, and where does that lead CREDO's research next? What would be the next steps coming from this book?
Well, as I mentioned, democracy has been at the center of our attention for decades, and I think that at this point we have now started 2 new research programs. The one is going to take off big time next month because we have a workshop. This is we call Africa Focus Group, which we are going to be looking specifically at the obstacles democracy is facing in Africa in terms of history, in terms of culture, and in terms of corruption, in terms of crime. Crime is one of the crime and policing. The police force is
Yes.
corrupt. And so we are looking at various aspects that affect democracy. But one of our concerns is not to work and write and research for each other, but actually share our knowledge and our findings with the wider public. And so a big chunk of our activities will be moving towards holding public webinars, towards issuing a monthly newsletter which highlights all our research activities as well as the findings. We are going to be analyzing, for instance, issues such as coalition formation. We believe that next election might not bring ANC to power, in which case coalition will be one of the options. And we are looking at what has been happening so far with coalitions, which is not very encouraging. And so we are looking at various contemporary issues that concern us very much. On the global level, we would like to look at democracy from a point of view of how to rethink it so that it can handle better its many problems. I am glad to see that Dirk is so very positive and optimistic, but I mean, data do, whatever negative aspects have been pointed out that could be misleading data readers. The fact is that democracy, we all can see that it's actually under pressure. And so we would like to have a look at what are the main drivers behind this, and whether there are any ways in which to counter the negative image that democracy has obtained lately. And I think one of the reasons for that is that democracy simply does not deliver what people have expected it to deliver. That is certainly the case in South Africa. That is the case in Poland, where democracy was seen as a means of getting rich quickly. And in South Africa, so many people are without jobs, and simply lives have not improved. So we need to get to the bottom of that and find out what exactly are the major drivers of the poor performance that turns people against democracy.
I found that very interesting in the comment by Catherine about Kenya, saying that the new constitution, it seemed to be a similar timing, that the new constitution generated an uplift in democratic support, but also because the state became better at providing social production. Was my understanding correct in terms of trying to understand why Kenya saw an increase in democracy scores?
Yes, I think you're right. So I said that there was a wave of optimism that could be explained by that transformation in our governance infrastructure. However, we also then discuss later in the book that a constitution without constitutionalism, or that the fact that constitutions don't exist in a vacuum, to be something that warrants investigation, because we have seen that in spite of having such a good constitution, undemocratic and clientelistic practices still persist So, yes, the constitution has been a step towards consolidating democracy, but we still need to transform the political culture.
Thank you, Catherine. Good. Dirk?
Chris, if you can show my table 5, which I skipped in my presentation because of shortage of time, you can see
Table 5.
table 5.
4, 5. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, here you can see some of the elements of institutional and cultural democratic resilience, or the opposite. And for all of our 16 cases, we could list whether there were institutional defects, for example. And well, the party system in Italy, for example, disintegrated. They have social movements of different kinds which have taken over this function, but which is not well working. In the United States, you have it's constitutional defects and institutional defects like the Electoral College, party financing, gerrymandering, similar things which are detrimental to democracy. And so across the board, from case to case and for different aspects, governance defects as corruption, weak economic performance as in Argentina, a weak party system, weak rule of law, restricted media are all working in a negative direction. And we could have, in a broad way, list all these elements. And on the other hand, strong regime support, as it was mentioned in Kenya by Catherine, strong social trust, strong social movements may also be conducive to more democratic resilience. So it's not a case of being overly optimistic or not. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'm pleading for a differentiation case by case. And there you can see it on the right-hand side, positive changes in Argentina, in South Korea, in Estonia, and some other countries, and you see some negative developments for some other ones. And our purpose was to find out which were the most important factors leading to one or the other outcome. And so my general plea is don't overgeneralize. And you know, there is a saying, who generalizes generally lies. And this is a playing with words, but there is some truth in it.
I like that very much. I have a question here in the Q&A. I think, Catherine, probably something for you. From Kay Brown, really asking whether a key difference between South Africa and Kenya was the length of time that democracy had to establish itself. So South Africa had this very quick transition to democracy, while Kenya's been going for a lot longer, and it's been a slow but steady process. Has that made a difference, do you think, in the resilience of democracy in the two countries?
That's an interesting question, and thank you, Kay, for the question. The transition to democracy, well, in our opinion, could made a difference in the sense that in Kenya, we had, well, our transition was separate from our transition from colonialism to, well, authoritarianism first and then democracy. Whereas in South Africa, the transition to democracy was also a transition from apartheid to democratic rule. I also think that another difference is that for the transition in South Africa, that was based on a new constitution, a democratic constitution. Whereas in Kenya, we had a transition from colonialism to authoritarianism. And then from authoritarianism had, transitioned to democracy in a very difficult environment and had to clamor for a new constitution, which then is the dispensation we are in now. So I would say in a nutshell that those are some of the differences in terms of the two transitions.
Context matters, and it's not good to generalize, I think, are probably the key takeaways. I think we've now run out of time. It's 4:05. Ursula, would you like to have a final word?
Well, again, I would like to very much thank you for making it possible for us to present our book. And talking about book presentation, we have a little gathering on Tuesday next week, and I will be donating one volume to our library. So any Stellenbosch student who's tuned into this program can go and have a look and read the book. And again, as I said, thank you so much for your support.
And maybe I should mention that we have a panel at the forthcoming World Congress of the International Political Science Association, and Cindy and Catherine and myself and some other member of CREDO will be present and present our results. So hopefully this will also be noted elsewhere.
Excellent. Congratulations on that invitation. That's wonderful. Good. Then I would like to wish all of you a very nice Friday evening and a good weekend. And I look forward to seeing the audience members again for the next Midpoint event. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.